Hello, good evening, and welcome to UPfront. Now, earlier today, the forecourt of the State House was the destination for the funeral of Ghana's longest-serving finance minister, Professor Kwesi Botchwey. And we should know that he was 78 at the time of his death. As you might have read or heard, there has been a lot of tributes from different quarters. But tonight, we go beyond these eulogies to explore the man's influence on Ghana's development. Joining me later in this conversation will be his colleague, Minister and former MP, Kojo Yankah. We'll also be joined by economist and former Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana, Professor Ernest Aite. Many may not be aware the former finance minister was a legal expert too, who obtained his doctorate in law, but he started off with a first degree in law from the University of Ghana, where he also taught law for some time. And from the law school, we are privileged to be joined by Professor Raymond Acquah, who is the current dean. But first, we'll start from the studio here. And speaking to a man who knew him very well and had interactions with him way back into the 90s. One who also hails from the same, place as the man we are talking about here. Professor George Odro is a former pro-vice chancellor of the University of Cape Coast. Distinguished professors and gentlemen, you're welcome to UPfront. I hope you're doing well, Prof.
Doing very well.
Terrible times. I mean, you were telling me about how it's been since the 90s that you've known the man. In the course of this conversation, I'm sure you've also known that two things have happened greatly. Now, governments have attempted to avert a full-blown strike by labor, which is demanding that pension be exempted from the debt exchange program. Government in an MOU has agreed to do exactly that. Labour not long ago just announced that it was no longer going to pursue this particular quest to call the nation into a full-blown strike on the 27th. So they've called off the strike. Government also rescinded its decision to include pension funds in the debt exchange program. I'll be joined by one of the colleagues, or let's say a junior colleague of Professor Botchwey in this conversation. Mr. Tekpe, who is a former finance minister, will be sharing some light on that particular topic too. But we can continue and start from our studios here. When we get Mr. Tekpe on board, certainly we'll be doing the debt exchange program and the very implications of government's decision. Prof, you're welcome once again.
Thank you very much.
Now, I was talking about, because you come from the same place with him, tell us about your very first encounter with Professor Botchwey and how that was.
Thank you very much. To start with, I think I must say that the people of Aguna Asafo in the Aguna East District have really lost a gem. I encountered Professor Kwesi Botchwey in 1996 when my dad died and I had to go to the village to perform his funeral. It was very encouraging when a cousin of his, Major Retired Ben Donko, who had been a role model for the young people of Aguna Asafo. Well, there was this thinking that Aguna Asafo had some spiritual powers, and therefore parents hardly sent their children to the hometown, to Aguna Asafo. And my parents never sent us there. So I did not know that Aguna Asafo had very well-educated people. It was at that funeral that I met the late Professor Kwesi Botchwey, who shared his experiences with me. And I was really encouraged that a man of that caliber, who had gone to Yale, who had gone to Michigan, who had so many intellectual, intellectual experiences, was from Aguna Asafo.
Interesting.
And that actually encouraged me to commit myself to Aguna Asafo. That's what Professor Kwesi Botchwey did.
So, you were impacted by him through that means. How did the people from the area see him? Did they see him as one of their own? Did they see him as one person who was a leading light in the area? Was he as popular in that particular area as he was in the Republic of Ghana entirely?
Okay, thank you. You see, if we look at today, if you were at the State House where the funeral took place, and you look at the chiefs that came over, to the extent that even the paramount chief himself had to come, that should give you an indicator that if he was not actually accepted by the people, his death wouldn't have been followed. He wouldn't have been followed there. Now, this was a man who actually projected the image of Agona Safo. And in fact, one of the chiefs would always say that, look, whenever I travel, I boast myself, I pride myself with Professor Kwesi Botchwey. Because you mention Professor Kwesi Botchwey and they ask from where Agona Safo, and say, oh, that is where Professor Kwesi Botchwey comes from.
Okay.
It projects the image. So in terms of popularity, he actually again has that popularity, you know. But this was a very principled man, who would not want to compromise institutional development, township development, constitutional development by normally whom, let's say, whom you know. He was a very principled. So of course, not everybody in Agona Safo may like him. But there's one thing that we can say about him: he was principled.
He was very principled.
He was very principled.
There is this write-up that suggests that it was one of those principles that eventually led to him leaving office at a point in time. That we would explore later on. But I understand we've been joined by the Dean of the School of Law at the University of Ghana, and that is Professor Raymond Acquah. Prof, you're welcome to our front.
And thank you for having me.
For many people, they knew his finance background. For many people, they knew he was finance minister, longest serving. They knew his economic acumen. The law part appeared to not have been as prominent as the finance background. I've seen a tribute by the School of Law, very glowing tribute, talking about how he was not only a student there, but he was also a senior lecturer at a point in time, way back in 1978. What lasting impression did the man leave on the institution and your very self?
So, Professor Botchwey was appointed to the then Faculty of Law, which is now the School of Law, in 1974. So he was primarily a lawyer and a law teacher. He was promoted in 1979 to the rank of senior lecturer. And he was actually seconded from the School of Law to the Ministry of Finance as minister. So in a sense, throughout the period that he was Minister for Finance, he was actually holding a primary position as a senior lecturer at the University of Ghana School of Law. When he unfortunately passed, we did some digging and spoke to a lot of his students and his colleagues, and 100% of them remembered him very fondly. They remembered his sharp intellect. They remembered the lasting impression on them in the lectures he delivered, especially in the areas of law and development and international trade law. On a personal note, Professor Botchwey was a lecturer at the Kennedy School of Government.
Okay.
When I did my master's at Harvard Law School. And he readily appointed me a research assistant to him. That was very useful because it's always good to have some extra dollars when you are struggling as a foreign student in another land. So beyond all that we talk about him in the formal sense, he was a very good human being. He was a very good person. And I remember we visited him in his house. He'd come and pick us up for some holidays, Thanksgiving holidays, to either his house or to Professor Champong's house. So beyond all the formal talk about his background and his work as a Minister for Finance, he was also a very down-to-earth, nice, kind human being. And that's what I wanted to bring to the discussion this evening. Just a couple of years ago, when I went back to Harvard to teach, he actually offered to get me accommodation in his house there. Of course, I eventually didn't take the offer, but that was how good he was, that was how kind he was, beyond all of the formal talk about his contributions to the nation.
There is a point, and I've seen the eulogy from the School of Law. There's a very interesting part of the lack of accountability and the inefficiencies in public corporations, which he identified in his writings and provided solutions for redress more than 4 decades ago, are still our lived experience in Ghana today. This is part of the eulogy. You know, especially mindful of the current circumstance that we are in today. There were people who were recently saying that, no, he should be speaking out and helping government out more. I do recall that they called on him in the last IMF engagement to provide some support to the government and lead the negotiation in the first place. Losing such a man, what heavy legacy, beyond what you have said about his personal traits, can we say he left for this republic?
So people like Professor Botchwey are quite rare. It's not easy to combine deep intellectualism with practical work. So if you look at his writings, the articles he wrote, the papers he wrote, they were intellectually deep. And if you look at his track record in public service, he did a lot of work in practical terms in getting the economy back to track. I'm happy Professor Aite is here because he's written a lot about the days when Professor Botchwey was finance minister. So that combination is not easy to have, and he had it. He combined the deep intellectualism with the practice. And that's why many people were calling on him to step in to try to assuage the economic woes that we find ourselves in currently.
Now, I'll bring Professor Ernest Aite into this conversation because, as Professor Atukba mentioned, if there's anybody I've read a lot about Professor Botchwey's period in office from, it's he, Professor Ernest Aite. He's a former Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana too, and also the Executive Secretary, the Secretary of the grouping, the Distinguished Group of African Universities, which are actually doing research, African Universities Association, Research Association. Professor Ernest Aite, you're welcome to our front. Yes,
thank you very much. Yeah.
Brilliant. And there's this question because they've talked about his personal traits. What was your first encounter with a man who had spent quality time reviewing some of his operations in office, and how was it like?
You know, I've always said to people that Professor Botchwey and I got to develop mutual respect for each other. He respected me, even though I criticized him a lot. He respected my work. In the end, we became, I wouldn't say friends, but people, we knew each other very well and could discuss things in a very clear manner. I first encountered him at the Ministry of Finance, even though as a student at Legon, I knew of him. He was in the law faculty at the time. I was in the economic department. I knew of him. And together with many of the other young faculty members of the time, the Chikates and Hoyt and all those people. So I knew of Kwesi Botchwey, but my first engagement with him was when he was already PND Secretary for Finance and Economic Planning. It was a very, very fruitful engagement. Very often when we had events at the university that required input from the ministry, we made contact with him, and he was always available to work with us, chairing events, speaking at events, and so on. So that's how I got to know him. I had a chance to do a book on the performance of the economy of Ghana, look at the miracle and the mirage. I remember one discussion I had with him. I said, everybody talks about the performance of the economy as if it was such a miracle, and only that miracle was portrayed. There were aspects of it that really suggested that there was a mirage there. And so my writing was to show both the strengths and the weaknesses of the economy at the time. And he understood that perfectly. He understood that perfectly. We discussed many of those things. One of the things I liked about Botchwey was his conversion to more liberal economics was a matter of pragmatism. He knew that to save the economy of Ghana, there was very little time and opportunity for us to be ideological. So he knew that. So in doing it, he didn't abandon his left-wing views. He didn't. He didn't abandon his interest in welfare of the people. He didn't at all abandon his interest in the ordinary person. That is why, in the middle of the reform process, that's why we're pursuing the ERP, the Social Adjustment Program, as a result of calls for some intervention to make things easier for the average person or poorer people in the society. We came up with PAMSCAD, the program of adjustment, the program of action to mitigate the social cost of adjustment, PAMSCAD. He was very, very supportive of it. If he wasn't a listening person, if he didn't care, there was no way we could have done that, but it happened. It is very reflective of the man. He was a very, very pragmatic person. He knew what needed to be done. He knew also how to ensure that the gains from it were as widely spread as possible. He was also very consistent. He wasn't the kind of person who would say today, let's do this, and then tomorrow change his mind because there's another view. No. The things that he accepted to do from the beginning, he stood by them and in a very consistent manner. That's something I liked about him. He was very, very articulate in explaining the policies. One of the challenges today we have in Africa is that governments say we will do this and make no effort at all to explain to people why it had to be that way. Kwesi Botchwey had the skill in talking to people and making them understand why things had to be done in a particular way. In view of the fact that he could speak so many different languages, it made it a lot easier for him to express those things to ordinary people, and they actually understood him. The third thing I would like to say is that when he was leaving office, many people didn't understand why he had to leave office in 1995. He left office, resigned from office, because in his view, the thing that he had fought for over a decade was really being dismantled at the foot of party politics. He was fairly aware of that. So he didn't want to be associated with the dismantling of the benefits from the reform program. So he had to leave. That shows me a man of principle. Finally, I want to make the point that Kwesi Botchwey became a more effective ambassador for Ghana and for Africa after he left office. I engaged with him a lot more after he left office, doing his work at Tufts, doing his work at the HIID at Harvard. I saw him working with Jeff Sachs and others do a lot of things to make African governments appreciate the need for reforms. Today, we know how the pandemic and other shocks have made it very, very difficult to manage your average African economy. But I can tell you one thing, if those governments had not embarked on earlier reforms, the consequences would have been much, much worse. So if today African governments are willing to discuss reform, they are willing to engage their own people in discussing reform, it must be due to the efforts of people like Kwesi Botchwey and a few other people. He was a man that very much believed in the principles that should govern any economy, any country at all. He worked hard to ensure that those principles were followed, and when he had difficulty with them, he stood away. He didn't hold on to power because that was the only thing to do. No, he made himself extremely useful to the world and to Africa by holding on to those principles. And that's what I will always remember him for.
I'll come in studio, but there's a question that's on the hearts of many, Prof. Saite. If he did such a wonderful job with reform in the 80s, how come we are where we are today?
You can do reform. That reform must be steady. That reform must be consistent. That reform must be followed through. You can't, as one person, continue to do it, it's something that might be followed through by other people. As I said, he left office because he saw the benefits or the advantages of the reform slowly disappearing as party politics gained root. He saw how we were using politics to take away from the authority of the central bank. He saw how we're using politics to turn the Ministry of Finance into simply a financier of government projects. So he walked away from that, having made clear the point that that should not be the right thing to do. If today we are struggling, it's because we have forgotten what those reforms were for. If today we are struggling, it's because we did not build on the reforms. I would like us to build on those reforms. Changing policies is fairly easy, but doing the hard work of actually building institutions is the more difficult part. Yes, he worked for several years as the finance minister, left office. The challenge for us, those of us remaining here, is how do we build the institutions that ensure that mismanagement is a lot more difficult.
Now, I'll come back to you, Professor Aite, because there's this question about he leading our very last IMF negotiation, and we are going into another negotiation. Some are saying that we are almost in that spiral of never getting out of this particular problem. But, Professor, I'll talk about there's the thinking in this country today that people like Professor Kwesi Botchwey should be held in high esteem, and perhaps others should see people like him as a role model. Do you think he's been placed properly in history as he's supposed to be?
I think that the best way to place people where they need to be in history is by living the values, the good deeds, the reforms that they championed whilst they were alive. Like Professor Aite has said, I don't think we've done enough of that for Professor Botchwey. So I want us to think about it in that way. The best way we can honor fallen heroes is by living the good deeds and the good reforms that they left behind. I don't see how else we can do it. Simply building empty monuments and worshipping them is not enough. Let's let their good deeds and the solid output, the solid work output they championed whilst they were alive, be our guide in order to build a stronger nation. It's the best honor we could give them.
Are there the likes of Professor Botchwey in Ghana today? This question came up consistently on the day that he was pronounced dead.
If you look in Ghana today, you would find some of the finest intellect, the finest practitioners, the most experienced public officers hidden in various parts of this country. What happens is that international consultancy firms and international development agencies pick on this talent and utilize it outside of Ghana. If you ask Professor Aite, he'll tell you the number of times he's had to reject offers for going out there to help other countries steer their economies. Unfortunately, our prophets are not considered prophets in their own home. We need to begin doing more of that. I do not see any of the crucial national development problems we are confronted with in Ghana today that cannot be handled by galvanizing very carefully and very thoughtfully a cadre of internal talent, which we have to address them. But we simply are not doing that. And I'm talking of all areas of national life, from economics to nuclear science to mathematics to COVID, you name it.
Surprisingly, the question I'm trying to ask following up is really why not so? If we have the pool available, why are we not tapping into that? Why do we appear more nourished when there is enough of the nutrition available?
Two reasons immediately spring to mind. One is the extreme and unnecessary polarization of our politics. We divide everything up in this country into NDC and MPP. No matter how valuable your input is, if you are a member of the MPP government, you are unlikely to be appointed or asked to help whilst the NDC is in office, and vice versa. So that's the first thing I would mention, is the first reason. It's very unnecessary. A number of presidents have deliberately not acted in that way, and they have seen results. When I worked on the Constitutional Review Commission, for example, appointed by President Mills, we worked alongside people who had very different political colorations from the then NDC government of Professor Mills. For example, Apia Menka, who is, I believe, a founding member of the MPP, was on that commission. So that's the first thing. The first reason is that we have this unnecessary polarization along party lines that reduces the number of experts that we have at every one time to assist in national developmental issues. The second reason is that I don't know if it is psychological. We seem to respect outer talent. We seem to respect external talent more than we respect internal talent. I don't know how the psychologists would call it, but like I said, I gave a quotation from the Bible. The prophet is never recognized in their own home. I believe that's the reason. So people from Ghana, experts from Ghana, are more and more helping other countries figure their issues out, make progress developmentally. But at home, they don't seem to have that shine. There are many other reasons, but for lack of time, let me just keep it to those two main reasons.
And I appreciate your thoughts very much on this particular one. Professor Anxiety, there is this question that cropped up. Professor Botchwey appears to be a man who understood the economy so well. And Professor Acquah is saying that we have all the very skilled people in this country. The pool of talent is abundant. So how come we are consistently having the difficulty? I guess the direct question I'm trying to ask you is that if Professor Botchwey were in charge of the economy today, would we have been asking for an IMF program, for example?
It's I'm struggling with how best to answer that question. One thing I want to add to what Raymond has just said is that a strong attribute of Kwesi Botchwey was his willingness to listen to other people. So he had people like RPC, Mr. Atta, working with him. There were many UAB and others. They were very good economists who worked with Kwesi Botchwey. So he may have come from a legal background, but he didn't hesitate at all to call on people. There are many of my friends from the economic department, from the University of Ghana, who were all roped in at one time or the other to assist. So that willingness to rope in other people, regardless of party colors or regardless of ideological bias and so on, that is one thing that we don't do much in this country today. Once somebody does not, we think he or she does not belong to the same orientation, then we sort of sideline him or her. I'm writing currently a piece called Trust and Economic Development in Africa. Trust and Economic Development in Africa. It is motivated by the book Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Basically, how do you build trust in the community and let that trust influence whatever changes will take place? Okonkwo refused to see the changes taking place around him, wouldn't listen to anybody, and in the end suffered what he didn't want to suffer. That is probably the biggest problem in Africa today. We don't pursue long-term reforms because those long-term reforms call for building trust across sections, calls for give and take. Let me give you an example, land tenure reforms. We all know that in order to modernize agriculture, you must invest a lot in irrigation. In order to invest a lot in irrigation, you must have reforms that make it possible for somebody to want to put a lot of money in there. You're not going to irrigate 2-3 acres of land. You're going to irrigate large tracts of land. But which means that we need at some point to pursue land tenure reforms. But we will not, as a people, ever discuss it. Why? Because we don't trust each other. We don't trust each other that we will use the land the way we want to talk, the way we talk about it. And so we will suffer with our agriculture because we don't trust each other. Kwesi Botchwey understood this. He understood this very, very well. He knew that we need to pursue long-term reforms, institutional reforms beyond the policy reforms. What he did was largely beginning with the policy reforms. He also knew that we needed to go beyond that to pursue institutional reforms, which included things like land tenure and many other similar things, which we didn't do. And until we learn that you don't need to belong to my political party, you don't need to belong to my ethnic group, you don't need to belong to my church in order for me to listen to you, we'll be just wasting our time. In another 10 years, we'll be back to square one. There will be instability in the macroeconomic. We will fix it and then we'll destroy it again. We've been doing this since 1992. We build and then we destroy. We build and then we destroy. We know how to bring down inflation. What we haven't learned is what to do after we've achieved single-digit inflation. We haven't learned how to do that, but it's possible.
The very last question I have for you, Professor Ernest Aite, is as we speak today, will Ghana come out of its current problems?
Ghana will come out of its current problems. I mean, whenever you go to the IMF program, you are only buying time. You buy time and you get resources. A lot of what will happen later will depend on how you use those resources. Whether you will go back in 5 years or in 10 years or never again depends on what you do beyond the IMF. So the IMF gives you resources and gives you time. Gives you resources, gives you time. What you do with that will determine exactly how long it takes for you to go back there again. If you use the resources to build the right institutions, if you use the resources to pursue the proper structural reforms, you will not go back. If we don't do that, we will go back in another 10 years, if not less.
Prof, I'm grateful for your time this evening, and I am grateful that you joined us. Maybe I'll take the final words from also Professor Tuguba. And as these gentlemen leave us, I'll be introducing another set of people who will be actually continuing the conversation. But Professor Tuguba, my very final question to you is about, I mean, you talked about the values being exemplifying the values that Professor Botchwey represented, being a more befitting way of keeping him in our memory. There is, however, the other proposal that a better way of actually memorizing him is making sure our economy does never degenerate to this level. Do you agree?
I think the two propositions are one and the same. If we had lived the values of reform, maintenance of traction on reform and sustaining reform, we wouldn't be where we are today. In other words, if we had lived the values that Professor Botchwey imparted to us in his years of work, our economy would not be where it is today. That's why I'm saying that the best memorial for giants such as Professor Botchwey is to live what they taught us continuously as a nation and pass them on to our children and our children's children so that we get out of the merry-go-round that Professor Aicha is talking about and have a process of sustained growth for the economy.
Grateful to you, Professor Raymond Acquah, for joining us this evening. Now,
Thank you.
As we switch, I'm bringing into this conversation a former finance minister, Mr. Sektepe, and also a former minister. He was minister at some point in time in the central region and also minister later on in the Ashanti region, Mr. Kojo Yanka. The Honorable is joining this conversation right away. And let's not forget, I have the very distinguished, and those of you who have not really remembered Professor Ojo very well, he had very, very wonderful views in this country about education when he was an active academic from the University of Cape Coast. So we'll be talking about all of that put together in proper memory of a man that we all respect. Now, Mr. Tekpe, you're welcome to our front. If you could unmute for me, I'll be very glad to engage you, sir.
Yeah, good evening to your viewers and to your listeners.
Very happy that you joined us. You have worked in the finance ministry. In fact, this is the longest serving predecessor that you can say was ever in that particular ministry for a very long time. What inspiration did you take from him getting to engage him? And beyond that, what can we do with his legacy?
Thank you very much. I listened to your last segment. And I think if you spare me a few minutes, let me say that I started my career after national service around the time of the introduction of the Economic Recovery Program. And I was a technical officer working with Professor Mills. I was a technical officer working with Dr. Botchwey, the late Misata, and Victor Salome, in what was then called the National Revenue Secretariat, and also the Structural Adjustment Program Secretariat. So as a public servant, I was virtually immersed in many of the discussions that were going on as a technocrat, particularly on the revenue side. And let me say that on a personal note, I had the honor. One thing Dr. Botchwey did was to strengthen the capacity within the Ministry of Finance and other agencies through scholarship and other schemes. And I had the privilege and the honor of Dr. Botchwey actually signing, approving my scholarship, which took me to Harvard. And later on, the privilege again of lecturing in his class when he was in Harvard. So I have some insights into some of what was discussed previously as a technocrat, particularly on the revenue side. Let me also say that the legacy of Dr. Botchwey is that he was always on call to the nation. He was always on call to the nation because he came back from the academic world to Ghana to work, let us remember, for both Professor Mills and for His Excellency John Mahama. Remember, he was chair of the economic management team. And remember, he was an advisor to both Professor Mills and to His Excellency John Mahama. So he never actually left the reforms. I think I agree with Professor Acquah that, with him myself, that the one thing we need is, and with Prof, the role Dr. Botchwey played was to bring the ship out of the turbulence, if I may use that analogy. Mm-hmm. out of the turbulence. But it doesn't mean for African countries that the sea will not be rough for us going forward. And that is the reason Dr. Botchwey was very keenly interested in the secondary reforms. Let me emphasize, the secondary reforms at the macroeconomic level that will sustain. And this is where the contribution was required. So let me give you an example. What is it that makes African countries unstable? As primary commodity, producers, when the price of commodities go up and down, your macroeconomic suffers because you get less revenue and you get less reserves.
Okay.
So you're seeing the fiscal implication, and you're seeing the fiscal and the reserves, the foreign exchange implications. And then it goes on to the real sector, because you are talking about agri, you are talking about resources for mobilizing, and every other sector, would be affected. So the sustainability of those policies through strong secondary reforms. So if you knew, and this was where he took a very keen interest and participated fully, if you knew, for example, that your commodity prices go up and down, and your economy goes up and down, then he was part of the discussion that with the advent of oil, and let me be very practical, he was part of those contributions. With the advent of oil, let us establish the buffers.
That's interesting. I seem to have lost him there, but
what the advanced country called buffers
okay,
or stabilizers. He was also keen. No, I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
No, I can hear you perfectly. We lost you for a second. Yeah.
Okay. He was also interested in another cause of instability, borrowing, paying interest, and not amortizing. Therefore, again, you see the use of oil in these secondary reforms, in setting up the sinking fund, so that when we go and borrow, we should not defer the payment. Dr. Botchwey was a strong advocate of that principle, that we should therefore set up a mechanism for payment, which is in the Constitution, which probably in his time, at the helm of affairs, the turbulence was so much that it couldn't be done. Because the sheer breadth of the reforms that Dr. Botchwey, worked on, and as was said, irrespective of where anybody came from. And let me cite, in our partisan approach today, people do not know that the Honorable Safo Mafo worked in. Most people do not know that the Honorable Alama Chematin in charge of Empretech was part of that team. Many people do not know. He mentioned, Prosaite mentioned Dr. Joabi and the work that he contributed in support. Many people do not know that Honorable Akoto said was in Dr. Abi's team. So you see the bringing together, of, knowledge from all over. And even when party politics came, many of these people continued until 1992. They were not hounded out, and all that. So okay. I'm saying that we should not view Dr. Botchwey in only historical terms. There was reference to the fact that, yes, he did chair. The program was negotiated, by the Minister for Finance and the Governor as is required by the IMF. He did chair and was part of the formulation of the homegrown policy that was used. So there is a contemporary relevance to Dr. Botchwey, which should not be underestimated, at all. And so you are seeing, the tools that we need. And I'm saying that these tools have worked for other countries. These are the tools. If you look at Zimbabwe, there is no BRIC country. There is no BRIC economy. The countries we call the BRICS, which do not, that is the most sustainable way of, of bringing in forex to stabilize the economy. As a result, you diversify it.
I have a question. Forgive me. I have a question for you, but forgive me to bring in my other guest. Yes, if you could allow me quickly. I need to bring in my other guest. Professor Jojo is with me in studio, but let me also bring in the Honorable Kojo Yankah. The question I'm asking you directly is about your experience with the man and the legacy that you think will be more befitting of his teacher and timber?
It was personal. It was
Sorry,
professional.
Mr. Tepe, if you can hear me, I'll come to you,
Oh,
but
Mr.
I was
Paul.
bringing
Okay,
in,
sorry.
yes, Honorable Kojo Yankah, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. No, okay.
If you can hear me, Mr. Yankah, yes.
Yes, Raymond.
Good evening.
I've been listening to the last bit of your discussions, and I want to put all together and say that Kwesi appeared within a certain political climate, within a certain political culture. Don't let us forget that he came in at a time when the mantra accountability and probity and all that was in the air. And he himself, which should not be forgotten, had a very deep knowledge of relationships between production, the law, government, and so on, what we commonly call political economy. So Kwesi, although was not an economist per se, he understood, having also working with all the people that Sekpepe and Honorable Sekpepe and the two professors were talking about, the kind of listening ear he had, the kind of a readiness to work with other people to deepen his knowledge. That was Kwesi. Kwesi for me was a very open-minded person, maybe because of the kind of training he had given himself. Marxist-Leninist analysis, he knew the left, he knew the right. He knew when to be pragmatic, he knew when to move from extreme left to center left. Kwesi was a down-to-earth person. Kwesi was not somebody who was caught up in what's, commonly called the academic tower. So he combined all these experiences and values, wherever he picked them. So he wasn't just, here is a great economist, meaning what for me? So for me, I learned so much from him. He demystified all the various, what one would call the difficulties in understanding economy, because he broke everything down to relationship with the law, with production, with ordinary people, with government. And therefore, and of course, don't let us also forget, he was a great communicator. So he came out of cabinet meetings or parliaments and then was ready to talk to the press and explain issues so practically and so easily for people to understand. It's something that I find very unique about Kwesi. And I'm sure people must have said it, that he knew about 5 or so Ghanaian languages, and he broke into them and simplified what the whole idea of budget and costs and production and everything was. So just as Honorable Tekpe is saying, if Ghana got oil, he definitely related it to what will it mean to the ordinary person?
Okay.
How is the production going to affect the nation's finances, and so on and so on and so forth. So I'm talking about the depth of knowledge he had, the easiness with which he navigated relationships with ordinary people, and then the ability to bring his scholarship to bear on society as easy as possible through his communication skills. Now, that's what I can say for now.
Now, I'll ask you about legacy, because I'm also looking into the future of people like that. And I'm also coming to studio because Professor Jojo has been with me all through. Prof, what's a more befitting legacy for a man that all of you around this table has paid very glowing tribute to.
As Professor Ayite Natubika earlier on said, the more befitting legacy that we can leave for Professor Botchwey is to live his values. And the value, I'm going back, I signed off on the note of principle.
Yeah.
As an educationist, I kept asking myself, if Professor Botchwey were the Minister of Finance, would he have recommended implementation of free SHS the way it has been implemented? When the Minister of Finance came to say that, look, those who can pay should pay, at that point, that's the principle, Professor Botchwey would have pursued that. And if it failed, he would have resigned, as he did. The second question is, would Professor Botchwey have advised His Excellency the President to concentrate on investing in cathedral when schools do not have textbooks? Schools are suffering when our hospitals don't have logistics. I'll say Professor Botchwey, by virtue of his pragmatic approach to decision making, wouldn't have done that. Then the last thing I see about Professor Kwesi Botchwey, which I think is threatening our systems, because we do not operate as he operated. I've seen Professor Botchwey when he was alive. He was someone who related with people irrespective of their partisan orientation, religion, and others. The fact that his schoolmate, university mate, I learned His Excellency the President was his mate. But ideological differences did not separate them, to the extent that today, at State House, His Excellency was there. If we, who are currently alive Ghanaians, will draw a line between our ideological orientation, our partisan orientation, and the relationship that we have with people, if we draw a line between institutional vision, institutional mission, institutional values, and allow institutions to speak for themselves, we will be able to celebrate Professor Kwesi Botchwey.
I should have an entire show with you on this conversation, right? Okay. We should be able to do that. Yeah. But let me go to Mr. Yankah. A glowing legacy that will be everlasting. How should it be materialized?
I definitely agree with Professor Odro and the previous speakers. Let's do some of the things that he introduced that made it easy to live in a system where you could see principles, where you could see truth manifested without looking on your left or on your right. I indicated that here was somebody who was very well deeply it was deep into Marxism, Leninism. He didn't say because he knew that he would close his eyes to the challenges that Ghana was facing. Again, Kwesi would not say that because he belongs to a certain religion, he won't talk to another person with another religion across the board. So let's have that kind of situation in Ghana where governments would appoint people with open minds. I think it helps everybody. Let government look at candidates for particularly very sensitive positions, and not sensitive, even important positions. Apart from those in cabinet who should be on top of the issues that they are managing, even those at the regional level, they should be competent. They shouldn't just be party agents who are just there to propagate party activity. It doesn't matter if you have a certain viewpoint that other people disagree with. But the important thing is that you must be on top of issues. Why, for example, are you a regional minister? We are a minister for the region, for the development of the region. Why are you a trade minister? You're a trade minister for the country. What our relationship with our neighbors should be your concern. International trade should be your concern. It shouldn't. We should say no to narrow-minded appointments in government.
I'm grateful. I'm grateful to you. I'll end with Mr. Tekpe, and before we go, because what's happening is also important, they have exempted pensions from the debt exchange program. Is it good or bad? Where will we get the money to fill in?
It only means we have to work harder, to satisfy the IMF. I think it's a major prior action, and, in reforms, you have these setbacks. And no less a personality than Dr. Botchwey, his drive, his motivation, and his ability to overcome challenges. Remember, he went through bushfires, during his time for the economy. There were various, as I said, price ups and downs. So I think in managing an economy, you come to these setbacks, you come to these challenges. And I think the lesson from that is, again, another attribute of Dr. Botchwey, which has been stressed, which is consultation. Being willing to talk to anybody, the market woman, all the way up, academics, his colleagues and everybody. And I think it's a lesson that when we are formulating policies, such as we did in Finchy and the rest, to bring people to the table to be part of the process, because you need to reflect, So obviously, I think that the quick answer to that is the government just needs to work.
Well, I seem to have actually had a difficulty there, but that's where we end today's edition of UPfront. Many thanks to you for joining the rather heavily packed conversation about a very distinguished personality in this country, longest serving finance minister, and the very attributes you heard. Professor George Owusu, we should talk consistently. Odro, should talk consistently in the future sometime. But I thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much. Thank you.